At my husband's funeral, the betrayal struck like thunder in a church. The lawyer stood stiff at the altar, his voice echoing as he announced that my husband's entire estate, our home, our savings, his business shares, was left not to me, his wife of 44 years, but to his mistress. And then the sharpest cut came. My own son turned, placed his hand on that woman's shoulder, and called her Mom. The greedy motive was laid bare in front of the mourners. They had plotted to erase me, to take everything Richard and I built together, and hand it over to a woman who never bore the scars, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices I had endured. They wanted me discarded like yesterday's paper, a footnote in the story of a man I had given my life to. But they didn't know. They didn't know about the folder I kept hidden in my handbag that morning, tucked neatly under my black lace gloves. They didn't know that while Richard had thought he was clever, drafting a will in secrecy, I had worked quietly with a different lawyer, his oldest and most loyal friend, to finalize a second document. A real will, one signed, notarized, and filed away where only I could reach it. Their smug smiles would soon curdle. They thought I was powerless, but I was about to show them how wrong they were. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from, because what happened next will chill you, and maybe even remind you that sometimes the dead have one last word left to speak. The funeral service had been heavy enough without that bombshell. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies, the kind that always made me nauseous. The organ music rolled low, mournful. Black hats and dark suits filled the pews, but no one seemed to notice that my hands shook as I gripped the edge of the pew. My granddaughter Emily sat beside me, her small hand resting on mine, steadying me like a rock in the middle of the storm. She was only 23, fresh out of college, but her eyes carried the same sharpness mine did when I was her age. She knew something was wrong long before the words left the lawyer's mouth. When he announced it, when he said the name Carla Mitchell, the mistress who had lingered like a shadow around Richard for years, the room gasped. Some guests glanced at me, waiting for me to faint, to weep, to collapse into grief. But I didn't. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and stared at the polished casket up front, the casket that held a man who had betrayed me even in death. Carla herself was seated just 2 rows ahead. She was dressed in a fitted black dress that was far too revealing for a funeral, her blonde curls cascading like she was a starlet instead of a widow's rival. My son, my own blood, leaned into her side. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered, loudly enough that the words carried through the quiet. My jaw tightened. He had called her Mom. Not mother-in-law, not by her name, but Mom. As if I no longer existed. Emily's hand squeezed mine harder, her nails digging slightly into my palm. She leaned close and whispered, "Grandma, what's happening?" I didn't answer her then. Not yet. My silence was stronger than any outburst. But inside me, something cold settled. I knew Richard had changed in his last years, staying late at the office, taking sudden business trips, brushing me off when I asked too many questions. I knew about Carla. I had even confronted him once years ago, but he denied it with such polished lies that I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. Still, I had lived long enough to know when trust was gone. The lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, cleared his throat. He had been Richard's corporate attorney, a man who always looked like his tie was strangling him. He read from the paper in his hand, voice clipped and businesslike. Richard Montgomery's estate, valued at $26 million, is to be transferred in its entirety to Carla Mitchell. Murmurs rippled. A woman behind me whispered, "Not his wife." Another muttered, "After 40 years?" I sat still, letting the judgment of strangers do the work for me. Let them see. Let them talk. Every word that spread would only make my revenge sweeter. Carla dabbed at her eye with a tissue, though her face didn't carry grief, only satisfaction. My son Andrew smiled faintly as if relief had washed over him. He probably imagined he was finally free from the shadow of his father's authority. He thought aligning himself with her meant he'd secure a share. Poor, foolish boy. He didn't know he had aligned himself with quicksand. When the service ended, people filed past me, offering condolences that sounded more like pity. "You poor thing," one said softly. "So cruel," another whispered. I nodded politely, offering no tears, no outrage. My silence unnerved them. That was good. Because silence, I had learned, is the sound that comes before a storm. Later, at the graveside, I stood a step back from the casket as it was lowered into the ground. Carla was at the front, her arm looped possessively through Andrew's. I could see the faint smirk at the corner of her lips, a woman who thought she had conquered even death itself. Andrew leaned close to her again, whispering words I couldn't hear, but the look in his eyes told me enough. He had chosen her side. Emily came to my other side, her arms slipping into mine. "Don't worry, Grandma," she said softly. "I believe you. I believe something isn't right." I turned my face just enough to look at her. She had Richard's dark eyes, but where his had grown cold, hers still carried warmth. I realized then that not all was lost. When the dirt hit the coffin with its first heavy thud, I let out a long, quiet breath. It wasn't grief. It was release. Richard was gone, but the fight he left behind had just begun. That evening, back at the reception, Carla played hostess in my own home. The audacity made bile rise in my throat. She floated through the living room as if she owned every corner, greeting guests, smiling graciously. Andrew followed her like a shadow. She stood in front of the fireplace where my wedding portrait still hung, and I nearly laughed at the irony. "Soon," she said loudly to a group of acquaintances, "this place will look very different. I've always imagined opening up the walls, maybe putting in skylights. It's so outdated." She wrinkled her nose as if 40 years of my life were nothing but bad decor. That was the greedy motive laid bare, dripping from her lips for all to hear. She didn't care about Richard. She didn't care about legacy. She wanted walls, skylights, furniture, and money. And Andrew, my foolish son, nodded beside her, agreeing like an eager schoolboy desperate for approval. Emily stayed close to me, watching, listening. She whispered once more, "What are you going to do?" I reached into my black handbag, my fingers brushing the folder inside. The real will. A document Richard had signed years before, back when he still remembered who I was, back when loyalty still lived in his veins. A will that gave me everything, and more importantly, safeguarded Emily's future. Not yet, I thought. Timing was everything. Let them believe they had won. Let them gloat. The higher they climbed, the harder the fall would be when I pulled the ground from beneath their feet. I smiled faintly, sipping from the crystal glass of water in my hand. "Emily," I whispered, "the dead don't always get the last word. Sometimes the living do." She didn't understand then. But she would. Soon, everyone would. The betrayal didn't stop with the funeral, it deepened. By the next morning, Carla had sent movers to my house. Boxes stacked by the door, her perfume lingering in the hallway where my husband's cologne once did. Andrew walked in like a stranger, his eyes cold, telling me this was for the best. The greedy motive was plain: they wanted me out, erased, so they could live like royalty on the ashes of my marriage. But what they didn't realize was that while they rushed to claim their victory, I had already set the trap. The shocking twist that awaited them was still tucked in my bag, the real will. When I revealed it, their empire would collapse. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I sat in my kitchen, the one room they hadn't dared to touch yet, sipping coffee in silence. Through the window, I watched men in work gloves carry out furniture. My sofa, my china cabinet, even Richard's old recliner, all shoved into a truck as if they were nothing more than junk. Carla stood outside in her sunglasses, pointing and directing with a hand on her hip. Andrew trailed behind her, nodding like an obedient child. Emily arrived mid-morning, her eyes flashing with fury when she saw the truck. "Grandma, you can't let them do this." I placed my hand over hers to steady her. "Let them. The higher they climb, the harder they'll fall." She frowned, not understanding. But she trusted me enough to keep quiet. Later that day, I visited the office of a man who had been my quiet ally for months, Mr. Thompson, a notary who had handled Richard's paperwork long before Carla ever slithered into our lives. He was in his 80s, with a head of snowy hair and eyes still sharp as glass. When I slid the Betrayal will across his desk, he adjusted his glasses, scanned the pages, and nodded. "This is airtight, Eleanor. Signed, dated, and properly filed. No judge in this state would question it." He looked up, his expression serious. "But if you reveal it now in anger, you risk looking vindictive. Timing is everything." "I know," I said softly. "I need them to show their true faces first. I need the world to see them as I do." And so I waited. Carla wasted no time transforming my home into her stage. She invited her friends over for dinners, sipping wine in my dining room, laughing too loudly while the smell of expensive perfume replaced the scent of my roses. Andrew sat at the head of the table as if he'd earned the right. Once, I overheard him telling Carla, "I never had a real mom. You were the one who cared for Dad when he was alive. You're the only one who ever looked after me." The words were a dagger. I had carried him through sicknesses, through heartbreak, through failures. And now, he had erased me in his mind, replacing me with her. I bit down hard on my tongue, tasting blood, but I did not speak. Instead, I gathered allies. Emily became my shadow, my quiet witness. She recorded conversations on her phone, snippets of Carla bragging to her friends about inheriting everything. Ruth, my neighbor, dropped by with casseroles and sharp eyes, noting every change in the house. Mr. Thompson prepared certified copies of the will, ready to deliver at a moment's notice. One evening, I sat in the parlor, watching as Carla pranced around in Richard's old robe, sipping from his monogrammed whiskey glass. Andrew laughed beside her, calling her mom again. I felt Emily's hand tighten around mine. "Why aren't you saying anything, Grandma?" she whispered. "Because," I murmured, "when a snake reveals its fangs, you don't swat it away, you wait for the strike. Then you cut off its head." She shivered at my tone, but she understood. The first crack came quicker than I expected. Carla, drunk on her new role, grew careless. At one of her dinner parties, she bragged to a friend within earshot of several neighbors, "It wasn't hard. Richard was mine years before he died. He promised me everything, and I made sure he delivered." Emily caught it on her phone. Clear, undeniable. The second crack came from Andrew. He cornered me in the kitchen one night, his voice cold. "You need to stop showing your face around here. This isn't your house anymore. Carla and I will make sure you're taken care of, but you don't belong here." I turned, meeting his eyes. "And where do I belong, Andrew?" He smirked. "A condo, maybe. Somewhere quiet, where you won't embarrass us. Carla says it's what Dad would have wanted." I smiled faintly, leaning closer. "Andrew, your father wanted many things. But what he wanted and what he left are two very different matters." He frowned, confused, but I walked away before he could press me. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed: Carla's arrogance on record, Andrew's betrayal in words, and the real will waiting like a blade under my sleeve. The funeral had been the stage for their victory. But the reading of the will in court would be the stage for their downfall. That night, as I stood by the window, watching the moonlight spill over the garden Richard once planted with me, I whispered to the darkness, "You thought you buried me, Richard. But what you really buried was her fate." And with that, I began preparing for the reveal that would shatter them both. When the funeral ended and the polished black casket was lowered into the ground, the town whispered louder than the falling dirt. Some mourners wept softly, others stood stiffly, but I could feel the eyes burning into me, not out of pity but curiosity. They were trying to piece together the puzzle of Richard's life, my silence, and Carla's sudden presence at the center of it all. The lawyer's words still echoed in the air, "Everything goes to Carla." I walked back to the house slowly, the crisp November air stinging my lungs. The streets felt too quiet, yet behind curtains, I knew lips were moving, speculating. By evening, I received 2 calls from neighbors. The first came from Mrs. Walker, an old friend who meant well but carried gossip like a badge. "Margaret," she said, her voice lowering as though someone might overhear, "I just have to ask, was it true? Did Richard really leave everything to her?" Her voice trembled with both concern and hunger. I gave her no satisfaction. "Funerals bring out confusion," I said calmly, then ended the call. I would not let my husband's betrayal become entertainment for this town. The second call cut deeper. It was from Pastor Green. His tone was careful, but I could hear the judgment tucked between his words. "Margaret, if you need guidance, I am here. But, it was unsettling to hear your son call that woman Mom. Families can be complicated." My throat tightened, and I swallowed back tears. I thanked him politely and hung up. They didn't know the truth. Not yet. But I did, and the truth was the only weapon I had left. Inside the quiet house, I poured myself tea and sat at the dining table where so many Thanksgivings had once been celebrated. My grandson Andrew's voice replayed in my mind. That word, Mom, tore through me more viciously than Carla's smug smile. My own son, blood of my blood, had folded me neatly out of the picture, as though I were a page in an old newspaper too yellowed to keep. I stared at the wood grain of the table, running my finger along grooves Richard had once filled with polish. My heart ached remembering the man he used to be, the man who brought me roses after long trips, the man who built this house with sweat and pride, the man who once swore his life belonged only to me. But that man had died years before his body did. The Richard who left this earth was someone else entirely, a stranger who slipped away into Carla's arms and left me humiliated in front of my community. I set the teacup down, steadying my breath. I could either allow their whispers to suffocate me or sharpen them into fuel. And in that moment, I knew I would not let Carla, or Andrew, walk away with dignity. The days following the funeral stretched on like smoke. People brought casseroles, not out of kindness but out of curiosity. They wanted to peek inside my house, searching for clues of the storm that had erupted. Ruth, my lifelong friend, came nearly every day. She never asked questions. Instead, she folded laundry, swept the porch, or simply sat with me in silence. One afternoon, Ruth caught me staring too long at Richard's leather armchair, still indented from his weight. "You're plotting something, Margaret," she said softly, her eyes narrowing with the wisdom of 50 years of friendship. "Maybe I am," I admitted, surprising even myself. She smiled faintly. "Good. Don't let them think they won." Her words struck like a spark on dry wood. Meanwhile, Emily, my granddaughter, became my quiet shadow. She was only 19 but carried an old soul in her eyes. One evening, she crept into the kitchen while I washed dishes. "Grandma," she whispered, "I don't trust Carla." I saw her smiling at Dad during the funeral, and it didn't look like grief. It looked like victory. I turned off the tap and faced her. "You're right, darling. But don't let on that you see it. Silence is the best disguise." She nodded, her jaw tight with youthful anger. In her, I saw a reflection of myself, decades younger but burning with the same fire. Nights were the hardest. Alone in my bed, I would remember things I wished I could erase. Richard on the phone in the den, his voice too soft when he said good night. Richard's sudden business trips, that stretched into long weekends. The faint scent of perfume on his collar that wasn't mine. For years, I convinced myself it was harmless, fleeting, that he would never dare shatter our family. But he had. Not only in secret, but in death, with a final cruelty delivered by his lawyer's lips. I tossed and turned until one night, I rose and went to Richard's study. Dust coated the shelves, but the air still carried a faint musk of leather and cigar smoke. I sat at his desk, my hands trembling as I pulled open drawers. Receipts, ledgers, letters, each telling me fragments of a story I already knew but refused to admit. Carla wasn't a fling. She was an investment. He had been funneling money toward her for years. But what Richard didn't account for was my own foresight. Months before his health failed, I had discovered one of his secret transfers. I didn't confront him then. Instead, I called our old lawyer, James. Together quietly, we drew up a new will, one Richard signed when guilt pressed heavier on him than pride. That document rested in a fireproof box, tucked neatly in Ruth's attic. I had hidden it there the night before the funeral. Carla thought she had won. Andrew thought he could erase me with a single word. They were wrong. Still, revenge isn't served by haste. It's carved slowly, carefully, so that every slice is remembered. I would not simply wave the will in their faces. I would make them feel the ground quake beneath them before it struck. The first tremor came at a community luncheon 2 weeks later. Carla arrived draped in black silk, her lips painted red as if mourning were a stage play. Andrew escorted her proudly, introducing her as though she had been my replacement all along. My stomach churned, but I smiled politely, my silence disarming them more than anger could. As Carla laughed too loudly and Andrew called her mom in front of anyone who would listen, I noticed Emily in the corner, her arms folded, eyes narrowed. Later she whispered, "Grandma, when are you going to show them?" "Patience," I told her. "The longer they bask, the darker the fall." Whispers floated through the luncheon hall. "Did you hear? Richard left everything to the mistress. Poor Margaret, she has nothing now." Their words stabbed me, but I didn't bleed. I let them believe it, because soon, their shock would be twice as satisfying. At home that evening, Ruth poured me a glass of wine and asked, "When will you bring out the real will?" "Not yet," I replied. "First, I want Andrew to see what loyalty costs." And I want Carla to choke on her victory before I strip it away. Ruth's eyes gleamed. Then I'll keep the box safe. But when you give the signal, it will be ready. The plan unfurled in my mind like a tapestry. I wouldn't just reclaim what was mine. I would expose Richard's betrayal, Carla's greed, and Andrew's blindness, all in one stroke. But before that day came, I needed them to believe the lie. So I sat in church pews with my head bowed while whispers hissed behind me. I walked the grocery aisles as neighbors avoided my gaze, ashamed for me, or perhaps entertained. I accepted their pity with grace, every nod, every murmured bless you stored as kindling for the fire I was about to ignite. Late one night, Emily sat beside me on the porch swing, the autumn air heavy with smoke from nearby chimneys. "Grandma," she said softly, "are you scared?" I turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Scared? Yes. But fear isn't weakness, Emily. Fear means you're standing on the edge of something powerful." Her eyes shimmered with tears. "I'll stand with you, whatever happens." My heart swelled with pride. Richard's betrayal had left scars, but Emily's loyalty reminded me that not all family turned to poison. By the time the first snow fell, Carla and Andrew had grown comfortable in their illusion. Carla hosted dinners in my house, redecorating rooms with gaudy furniture. Andrew paraded her around town like a queen. And I, in their eyes, was the fallen widow who had lost it all. But they didn't know that Ruth's attic still cradled the box. They didn't know that every whisper, every humiliation, every false smile was only sharpening the blade I would soon deliver. And when the time came, when the lawyer read the real will, it wouldn't just shift money. It would shift power, legacy, and loyalty. They thought betrayal was the end of my story. They hadn't realized, it was only the beginning. The betrayal cut deeper than bone when Andrew burst into my room 2 nights before court. He didn't knock, just shoved the door open, suitcase in hand, as if I were squatting in my own house. His voice was colder than the night wind seeping through the windows. "Pack your things, Mom. Carla doesn't want to wait for the eviction. You're leaving tonight." The greedy motive was plain. He wanted me gone before the court date so Carla could parade around this house without me glaring from the shadows. He thought he could erase me with an order. But the true power wasn't in these walls, it was in the papers folded neatly inside my handbag. The shocking twist would destroy them both in front of the entire town, and when I pulled it out, their smug faces would shatter. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from, because what happened next turned betrayal into justice in a way no one saw coming. I looked at him carefully. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp, but I searched for the boy I once raised. The boy who used to chase fireflies in the yard, who once whispered, "You're my favorite person in the world, Mom." That boy was gone. Carla had hollowed him out. "I'll leave when the law tells me to," I said, steady and calm. His face twisted. "You're pathetic. Carla's right, you never knew how to let go." I met his glare. "And you never knew how to hold on." His lips trembled, anger, maybe shame, but he slammed the door so hard the mirror rattled on the wall. That night, I sat with a candle burning low, shadows crawling across the ceiling. I thought of Richard, not the man Carla claimed, not the liar who betrayed me, but the man I once loved. The man who promised forever, who built this home brick by brick. And then I thought of his final cruelty, leaving me humiliated at my own husband's funeral. I let the grief wash over me one last time, then set it down like a stone. Tomorrow wasn't about grief. Tomorrow was about justice. The courthouse loomed gray and massive against the winter sky. Snow clung to the steps as Emily and I climbed them. She clutched my arm tightly, her 19-year-old face glowing with determination. Ruth walked behind us, holding her handbag like a shield. Inside was the fireproof box. Inside the box was the real will. The benches were packed, neighbors, church members, curious faces. Whispers rippled through the air, "She has nothing left. Carla owns it all. Poor Margaret." Carla had spread her story well, the noble mistress who finally received recognition, the bitter widow refusing to face reality. But whispers are fragile. Today they would turn. Carla arrived like a starlet on a red carpet. Her black suit was sharp, her heels clicked like gunshots, her crimson lips curved in triumph. Andrew strutted beside her, puffed up like a king escorting his queen. Their eyes found me immediately. Carla smirked. Andrew grinned. To them, I was already buried. Emily squeezed my hand under the table. It's time, Grandma. Not yet, I whispered. Let them fall from higher up. Mr. Adams, the lawyer, cleared his throat at the front. His papers shuffled as he spoke. We are here to read the last will and testament of Richard Thompson, deceased. The room hushed. Carla leaned close to Andrew, her nails tapping his hand. He whispered something that made her smile like a predator with prey cornered. Then Adams read the words that had broken me at the funeral. I, Richard Thompson, leave my estate, assets, and holdings to Carla Jennings. Gasps tore through the benches. Carla sat taller, her chin high. Andrew leaned back, his arms stretching smugly across the bench. Whispers rose, so it's true. Everything to the mistress. What about Margaret? I bowed my head, letting the weight of their arrogance settle. Let them believe it. Pity burned around me like a fire. It would only sweeten what came next. Any objections? Adams asked. Carla let out a soft laugh, waving her manicured hand. Of course not. Richard and I were. Objection, I said, rising to my feet. The word cracked like thunder. Silence fell. Every head turned. Carla froze, her smile dropping. Andrew's smugness drained away. Adams blinked. Mrs. Thompson, on what grounds? I pulled the folder from my handbag, holding it high. My voice rang steady, on the grounds that this is not Richard's last will. This is. Gasps erupted again. Carla's face went white, then flushed scarlet. She bolted up. That's impossible. Richard's lawyer. Richard's old lawyer, I cut in, handing Adams the folder. This will is signed, dated, notarized and filed. He scanned quickly, his lips pressing tight. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, he looked up. This document appears valid. The room exploded. Neighbors muttered, heads swiveled. Someone whispered, she had it all along. Another hissed, Carla lied to us. Carla shrieked, her voice cutting through the noise. Forgery. She's forging it. Andrew, tell them, say something. Andrew's face was pale, his forehead shining with sweat. His lips opened, but nothing came. His eyes darted from Carla to me to the will in Adam's hands. Then Ruth stood, her voice clear and sharp. I witnessed Richard sign that will. I was there. He left everything to Margaret and Emily. Not to her. The benches gasped again. The tide shifted instantly. Whispers now lashed like whips, she tricked them. All this time she lied. Carla clawed at Andrew's arm. Do something. But Andrew sat frozen, his pride collapsing. The judge, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. His gavel slammed. Order. This is serious. We will examine both documents fully. Witnesses will be questioned. Signatures verified. Until then, the estate is contested. Carla lost control. She lunged forward, pointing at me with shaking hands. She's a liar. A bitter old woman who couldn't keep her husband, who... Silence. The judge barked, his gavel thunderous. One more outburst and you'll be held in contempt. Carla sat, trembling with rage, her lips pressed tight. Emily squeezed my hand. Her eyes glowed with pride. You did it, Grandma. But I shook my head, whispering, not yet. We've only opened the door. The storm hasn't even hit them. Because this was only the beginning. The next hearings would bring witnesses, evidence, and the truth laid bare for all to see. And when it ended, they wouldn't just lose the estate. They would lose their names. Carla's voice cracked through the phone line 1 week after the last court session, her tone half rage, half desperation. You think you've won, don't you? She hissed. But you don't know me. I will never be erased. Richard loved me more than you. He promised me everything. Her words echoed in my ear, but instead of fear, I felt only pity. I knew her kind of desperation well, the kind that builds when greed finally hits a wall. I didn't hang up right away. I let her rant, her sentences running in circles, contradicting themselves, every word betraying the unraveling of a woman who had already lost. Finally, when her voice broke into a sob, I whispered the only sentence she didn't expect. "Carla, you've already erased yourself." Then I ended the call. But her downfall didn't arrive quietly. The next morning, I walked into town for groceries. Whispers followed me like shadows. At first I thought they were still doubting me. But as I moved past the bakery, then the florist, I realized the whispers were not about me anymore. They were about her. Someone had leaked a recording from the courtroom, the moment she screamed, "I was promised," while the judge stared her down. Clips of her meltdown circulated online. On a local news site, the headline read, "Funeral Mistress Exposed, Attempted Fraud in High-Profile Estate Case." Carla's name was everywhere, but not in the way she wanted. She had wanted power. She had wanted admiration. Instead, she became a cautionary tale, her face plastered with words like schemer, fraud, and mistress. At first she tried to fight it. She wrote long rambling posts on social media, claiming she was the victim of an ageist conspiracy, that I had brainwashed Richard's son, that the will I revealed was forged. But the more she screamed, the less people listened. Her words became background noise to her own collapse. Andrew, meanwhile, began to appear less at her side. He came to see me once, late in the evening, after the sun dipped low and the streets turned quiet. His face was pale, his tie loosened, his shoulders hunched like a boy who had been caught in a lie. "I didn't know," he said at my door. His voice trembled. She told me Dad hated you, that he meant for her to have it all." I swear I didn't know the truth. I looked into his eyes and saw the little boy I once read bedtime stories to, the young man who carried his father's casket. But I also saw weakness, the kind of weakness that made him easy prey for a woman like Carla. "You knew enough," I told him gently. "You knew she didn't respect me. You knew she pushed me aside at your father's funeral. You chose silence. That silence almost cost you everything." Tears welled in his eyes, and for the first time, I saw regret settle like a stone in his chest. He didn't argue. He only nodded and left, shoulders slumped. From that night on, I never saw him at Carla's side again. The more Andrew pulled away, the harder Carla tried to claw back control. She showed up at my house one afternoon, her lipstick smudged, her dress wrinkled, her eyes wild. She pounded on the door, shouting for me to let her in. I watched through the curtain as she screamed at the wood, spittle on her lips, her fists red from striking the frame. But I did not open the door. I did not give her the stage she craved. I let her shout into silence until the neighbors began to film her, and she fled down the street, hair flying, dignity shattered. Her descent accelerated. She tried to launch a small business using what little savings she had, some boutique idea about legacy coaching. But no one signed up. Every potential client Googled her name and saw the words estate fraud, mistress scandal, courtroom breakdown. Sponsors pulled away. Landlords hesitated. Even her so-called friends stopped answering her calls. I learned from Ruth that Carla had begun wandering into the local bar in the afternoons, drinking until her words slurred, telling anyone who would listen that I had stolen her future. But the more she spoke, the less anyone cared. By winter, Andrew had moved out of the house they shared. Rumors spread that he filed for divorce, though I didn't ask and he didn't tell me. He began showing up at church alone, head bowed, shoulders heavier than before. Carla, meanwhile, grew thinner, her once polished hair now limp, her bright clothes swapped for wrinkled cardigans and smeared mascara. One evening, as the snow began to fall outside my window, I received another call. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Please," she said. Just give me something. Anything. I don't have a place to stay." "I don't have," her voice cracked into silence. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. A part of me, the part that once pitied her, almost softened. But then I remembered the funeral, the smugness in her voice as she stood beside my son, claiming Richard's life as her prize. I remembered the way she smirked when the lawyer read the false will, the way she thought she had finally broken me. "No, Carla," I whispered. "This is the house you built. Now live in it." And I hung up. Her downfall became complete not with a bang, but with silence. Spring came, and the world moved on. The case was closed. The Betrayal will stood. The house remained mine, as Richard had intended. But more than the bricks and walls, I had reclaimed something far greater, my dignity, my voice, my place in a story she tried to erase. Carla, meanwhile, disappeared. No one saw her at the bar anymore. No one answered her calls. Her name became a ghost in town, whispered occasionally, then forgotten. She didn't go to jail, she didn't die, but she lost something far worse to her greedy heart. She lost relevance. Sometimes, when I walk past the roses Richard planted in our garden, I imagine her sitting alone in some small apartment, staring at the walls, wondering how it all slipped through her fingers. She thought power came from money. She thought legacy came from stealing. But in the end, power came from truth, and legacy came from love, two things she never understood. One evening, I hosted a small dinner. Ruth came, along with a few close friends. We laughed, we shared stories, we remembered Richard with warmth instead of grief. As I cleared the plates, I paused by the window and saw the stars glimmer above. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace. Carla's story ended not with triumph, but with emptiness. And mine continued, stronger, sharper, more alive. To everyone listening, if you've ever been betrayed, if someone has ever tried to erase your worth, remember this: you do not need to fight with fists or scream with rage. Sometimes, all you need is patience, truth, and the strength to stand still while their own greed consumes them. Because revenge does not always roar. Sometimes, it arrives as silence, and silence can be the loudest victory of all. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your story matters too.